It's about to get interesting, so subscribe and hit like so you don't miss the top content.
I sat at the kitchen table in our house in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon, staring at the empty coffee mug I'd never bothered to put away. It was drizzling outside the window, a light rain, typical of the area, and the drops dripped down the glass, leaving a blurry trail. The house was quiet, just the ticking of the wall clock that Amy and I had bought at the crossroads a couple years ago, when we still thought little things like that mattered. She'd left in the morning, said she was going to a friend's house, but I'd long ago stopped believing her excuses. I knew she was seeing someone else. It was like a splinter I could feel but couldn't pull out until I saw the proof with my own eyes. Amy and I had been together for 8 years, 5 of them married. We'd met in college, in some rowdy bar where I'd spilled beer on her jeans and she'd laughed instead of getting angry. She seemed like the liveliest girl in the world to me then, with short brown hair and eyes that seemed to glow when she talked about books or her plans to open a coffee shop. I was just a regular guy, working in the IT department of a local insurance company, fixing computers and drinking too many energy drinks. We got married in a small chapel outside of town, and for the first few years everything was like a dream. Trips to the coast, evenings with wine and stupid movies, plans to get a dog. But then something broke. Maybe I got too involved in my work, or maybe she got tired of waiting for me to notice that she was unhappy. I don't know. It started with little things. She started staying late more often after her shift at the coffee shop she eventually opened with the help of some investor. She said she needed to finish orders, check on deliveries. I nodded, though something inside was clenching. Then I noticed how she started hiding her phone. It used to just lie on the table, but now she took it with her, even into the bathroom. One day I heard her laughing into the phone while standing in the backyard, and her voice was soft, almost gentle, not at all the way she'd been talking to me for the past few months. I didn't ask, didn't want to know, but a couple weeks ago, I couldn't stand it. It was the evening after she told me she was going to a girls' night out. I sat at home, staring at the TV, but my thoughts revolved around her. I picked up her laptop. She'd left it on the couch, which was rare, and opened my email. I knew the password. She hadn't changed it since college. There was an email from someone named Jake. "Can't wait for tomorrow. You're making my days better," was what he'd written. And then more, about meeting at some cafe downtown, about how he missed her when she wasn't around. I flipped through the correspondence, feeling my stomach twist into a knot. They'd been seeing each other for weeks, maybe months. She'd written to him that she felt empty with me, that she didn't know how to leave. I closed the laptop, put it back down and went to bed, but I didn't sleep. Just lay there staring at the ceiling until she came back in the morning, smelling of someone else's cologne. I didn't tell her I knew. I continued to pretend everything was normal, making coffee, asking how things were going at work, even fixing her car when she complained about the brakes. But inside, I was seething, not from anger, but from something else, the feeling that I'd been erased from her life like an unnecessary line in a letter. I wondered what to do. Divorce, go away and leave her the house, or make a scandal, spill everything I'd found, but I couldn't make up my mind. And then, this morning, after she'd gone to a friend's house, I found the letter. It was on the kitchen table, under a stack of bills we'd both ignored, a plain white envelope, no address, just my name, Matt, written in her smooth handwriting. I froze, staring at it as if it might bite. My hands reached out and unfolded the paper, and I began to read. It was a long letter, 3 pages of small letters. She began by saying she knew that I knew. Said she'd seen the way I'd been looking at her for the last few weeks, like I was waiting for her to admit it herself. And then she wrote something that turned everything upside down, an explanation I didn't expect, not an excuse, but something more, something that made me reread the lines over and over again, trying to figure out if it was true. She was writing about Jake, but not in the way I thought she would. It wasn't just a crush, not a casual fling. She told me how he'd come into her life when I'd stopped noticing she was drowning. How he became not a lover to her, but an escape from something I didn't even realize I had. She mentioned things I couldn't string together, about the night she cried in the bathroom and I thought she was just tired, about the phone calls she dropped when I was around, and then she wrote about the secret she'd kept from me all these years, something that had happened before we were even married, something that had broken her, but she couldn't say. She didn't reveal what it was, only hinted that it had to do with her past, something I should have noticed but hadn't. I sat there, with the letter in my hands, feeling the rain outside the window grow louder and the kitchen shrink around me. The letter didn't exonerate her completely. She had admitted to herself that she had betrayed me, that she had chosen the worst path, but it made me wonder if I was as innocent as I thought I was. I stood up, walked to the window and stared out at the wet street, trying to figure out what to do next. She knew I knew, and now I knew more than I wanted to know, but less than I needed to know to decide whether I hated her or myself. I stood at the window, clutching the letter in my hand as the rain outside the glass turned into a solid mist that blurred the outline of the street. The kitchen felt foreign to me, like I was in this house for the first time, even though Amy and I had lived here for almost 5 years. The letter was on the table, crumpled in the corner where I'd tossed it after the second reading, and the lines were still rolling around in my head, clinging to my thoughts like wet leaves to asphalt. She knew what I knew about Jake, and instead of denying it or begging for forgiveness, she dumped this mixture of truth and innuendo on me that left me hanging. I couldn't just walk away or kick her out, not after what she'd written, but I couldn't forgive either. I went back to the table, picked up the letter, and reread the part where she mentioned her secret. She didn't name it directly, just outlined the shadow of something big that had happened before we were married. She wrote that it had to do with her family, with leaving her small town in Idaho and never looking back, something that made her feel guilty every time I asked about her past and she guffawed or changed the subject. I remembered how tense she'd gotten when I'd offered to go to her parents' house for Thanksgiving, how quickly she'd found a way to say no. I'd thought it was just a complicated relationship with her mother, but now I realized there was more to it, something she'd hidden even from herself until it started to destroy her from the inside out. She wrote that Jake had found out about it by accident when they were sitting in some bar after work. She'd had too much wine, and the words had come out of her mouth. He didn't judge her, didn't look away, just listened, and that, she said, was what tied her to him. I sat there, looking at those lines, and tried to remember the last time I'd really listened to her. Instead of just nodding, jabbing at my phone or staring at a screen. Maybe she was right, I'd stopped noticing how distant she was getting, but that didn't excuse what she'd done. Or did it? I didn't know. I stood up, walked over to the hall closet and pulled out an old box that held our shared stuff, photos, concert tickets, junk we'd saved up thinking it was important. I wasn't looking for anything specific, I just wanted to find some clue, something that might hint at her secret. There was our engagement photo, us standing by Crater Lake, her smiling and me putting my arm around her shoulders, but now I noticed her smile was strained, like she was forcing herself to look happy. I flipped the picture over and there was the date, 3 months before the wedding. Something had happened in that interval, something she couldn't tell me about. Then I found something else, a small notebook, tattered, with a faded cover. It was at the bottom of the box, under a stack of postcards. I opened it, and the first page was scrawled in her handwriting a list of names, some dates, nothing I could make out. One name was repeated several times, Leah. I didn't know any Leah among her friends or coworkers. Further down were blank pages, but at the very end was a note of sorts, written in a different pen, more hurriedly. I can't go back. That was it. I sat on the floor holding that little book and felt a chill building up inside. It had to do with her secret. I knew, but I couldn't put the pieces together. Who was Leah? Why couldn't Amy come back, and how did it lead her to Jake? I put the book back in the box, not wanting to dig any further. Something told me that if I learned more, it would break me completely. Instead, I picked up the letter and walked out into the backyard. The rain was still drizzling, the wet grass sticking to my shoes, but I didn't notice. I stood there, looking at the flower bed she'd planted last spring that we'd both abandoned. In my pocket was a lighter I hadn't smoked in a year, but for some reason I carried it with me. I took it out, held it up to the letter, and watched as the flame lit the corner of the paper, but I didn't light it. My hands shook, and I threw the lighter into the grass. I couldn't burn it. I couldn't get rid of what she'd written, because it was the only thing that gave me any hint of the truth. I went back into the house, wet and tired, and sat down on the couch. The phone lay beside me, the screen dark, but I knew she wouldn't call. She'd given me that letter as a parting shot, as a way to get away, leaving me to deal with the wreckage. But the secret she hid in those lines kept me in suspense. It was something more than cheating, something that could explain why she'd chosen him over me, and I knew I'd look for answers, even if they destroyed what was left of us. I just hadn't decided where to start yet. I sat on the couch, staring at the wet footprints my boots left on the wooden floor while the silence in the house pressed harder on my ears than the rain outside the window. Amy's letter lay on the coffee table, crumpled but still intact, and I couldn't take my eyes off of it. The notebook from the box was in my hands, and I flipped through it over and over, clinging to the few words she'd left behind. Leah and I can't go back. It was like a puzzle I didn't want to put together, but I couldn't quit. I realized that if I didn't figure it out now, I would live with this question for the rest of my life, wondering what I'd missed. So I got up, grabbed my car keys, and decided to drive to where I thought the answers might be. I headed toward Amy's coffee shop, a small place in downtown Portland, with a shabby awning and an Amy's Brew sign she'd painted herself. She must have been there with Jake, since she hadn't come home after she'd left the letter. The rain intensified, and the windshield wipers of my old Toyota squeaked, but I drove slowly, thinking about what I'd say if I saw her, or him. I parked across the street, turned off my headlights, and just watched. Through the fogged windows of the coffee shop, I could see the lights, but I couldn't make out the movement inside. I got out of the car, feeling the water immediately soaking my jacket, and walked closer. The door was locked, the closed sign hung crookedly, but I could see her silhouette through the glass. She was there, alone, sitting at the counter with a mug in her hands. Jake wasn't in sight. I knocked, quietly at first, then louder, until she looked up. Her face went pale as she recognized me, but she got up and walked to the door. The lock clicked and I walked in without waiting for an invitation. Inside, it smelled like coffee and cinnamon, and the floor was strewn with crumbs from the baked goods she'd probably been making all day. I pulled my notebook out of my pocket and placed it on the counter between us. She looked at it, and I saw her hands trembling. I didn't say anything, just waited for her to start on her own, and she did. She told me everything she'd been hiding these years, and her secret was harder than I could have imagined. Leah was her younger sister, 3 years younger. They grew up in a small town in Idaho, in a family where the father drank and the mother pretended not to notice. Amy was the oldest, the one who protected Leah when her father came home in a rage. But at 16, Amy had run away, gone to Portland with a boyfriend who promised her a new life, leaving Leah alone. She thought her sister could handle it, that she was strong like Amy. But a year later, her mother called her and told her Leah was missing. No one knew what had happened. The police had only found her jacket by the river, but no body had ever been found. Everyone assumed she drowned, maybe on purpose. Amy didn't come home, didn't go to the funeral, which never happened because there was nothing to bury. She cut herself off from the past, but the guilt stayed with her like a shadow. She told me that it had been eating her up all these years. When we got married, she tried to forget, to build something new with me, but every night when I fell asleep next to her, she thought of Leah. She blamed herself for abandoning her sister, for not coming back when she could have saved her. And when the coffee shop started drowning in debt a couple years ago, when I was working late and didn't see it falling apart, Jake showed up. He was one of the suppliers, bringing in beans from some local roaster. They got to talking one night and she broke down, told him about Leah, about how she hated herself for it. He didn't try to fix her, didn't give her advice, just listened, and that was the salvation she didn't find in me. She admitted that she'd never slept with him, that it wasn't an affair in the usual sense. They met, talked, sometimes held hands, but it never went any further than that. She said she wasn't looking for love in him, but for a way to survive because I had become a stranger to her, too busy, too distant. She wrote the letter to make me realize that her betrayal was not just a betrayal, but a cry for help that I didn't hear. She wanted me to know about Leah, but she couldn't say it to my face until I came here with that little book where she'd written down her thoughts after her escape. I stood there, listening to her, and felt the anger that had been burning me for weeks dissolve into something else, not forgiveness, but understanding. Her secret didn't excuse everything she'd done, but it showed me that I was part of the story, too. I didn't notice how she was drowning in her past, how her smile was becoming more and more fake. I left the coffee shop without a word, leaving my notebook on the counter. The rain poured harder and I sat in my car, looking at the road ahead. I didn't know if we would divorce, if we would stay together, but now I knew the truth. Her cheating wasn't all her fault, and that knowledge shook me more than I'd expected. I drove back home through the wet streets of Portland, headlights catching the puddles and the sparse figures of passers-by hurrying to get out of the rain. My mind replayed everything Amy had told me at the coffee shop about Leah, about how she'd broken down, about Jake, who'd become a lifeline instead of a lover. The rain pounded on the roof of the car, drowning out the noise of the engine, and I felt lost, like someone had pulled the ground I'd been standing on all these years out from under me. I didn't know what to do with this truth, but I realized it had changed everything. When I parked in front of the house, the lights in the windows weren't on. Amy had stayed at the coffee shop, and I wasn't sure if she'd even come back. I went inside, dropped my wet jacket on the floor by the door, and made my way to the kitchen. The letter was still on the table, next to the empty mug, and I picked it up. I didn't reread it. Every word was already seared into my memory like a scar. Instead, I took the matches we kept for candles out of the drawer and lit a corner of the paper. The flames slowly crept upward, devouring her handwriting. and I watched as it turned her confession to ash. I wasn't relieved, but it was necessary, like a period at the end of a sentence that had hung in the air for too long. The ashes settled into the sink and I rinsed them off with water, watching the black flakes disappear down the drain. Then I sat down on the couch, hands on my knees, and just stared into the void. My thoughts were jumbled, but one thing was clearer than the others. I couldn't blame her. Yes, she betrayed me, gone to Jake, even if not in the way I'd first thought, but I'd been blind, too. I couldn't see how she was drowning in her guilt for Leah, how her past was slowly killing her. I worked late, came home tired, and instead of asking what was wrong with her, I just turned on the TV and shut it off. We'd both lost each other long before Jake came along, and her letter, her secret, just showed it in all its glory. I decided I wasn't going to wait for her return. Not today, not tomorrow. I got up, packed my bag, a couple t-shirts, jeans, toothbrush, and wrote a note. Nothing long, just, I need some time. You know where to find me if you want to talk. I left it on the table, next to the very box where I'd found the notebook. Maybe she'd come back and see that I'd only taken my stuff and left hers untouched. The coffee cups, the pictures, the flower bed in the backyard. It wasn't the end, but it wasn't a sequel either. It was a break to figure out who we were to each other now. I got in the car and drove to my brother, Travis, who lived an hour away, in a small town by the Columbia River. He didn't ask any questions when I called and told him I was coming, just mumbled something about beer in the fridge. The drive was long, the rain was subsiding, and I turned on the radio, some old song about forgiveness quietly filling the cabin. I didn't know if I'd ever forgive Amy, but I realized that her secret, the story with Leah, didn't justify cheating completely. It just explained why she'd broken, and I was part of that break too, because I hadn't reached out when I could have. When I got to Travis' house, he met me on the porch with a can of beer in his hand. I took it, took a sip, and sat on the steps looking at the river in the distance. Amy had shocked me with her letter, with her truth, but I knew now that the shock wasn't just in what she'd done, but in how we'd both gotten to this point. We didn't divorce that night, we didn't separate forever, but I felt like it was the end of the life we had been building. Maybe later we'd find a way to talk, to see if there was anything to salvage, or maybe there wouldn't. But sitting there, under the stars that were beginning to break through the clouds, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in a long time, and that was enough to end this chapter. It had been 10 years since that rainy night when I'd left home with a bag on my shoulder and a note for Amy on the table. I was sitting on the porch of a small lake house in Washington state, near the Oregon border, looking out at the calm water that reflected the morning sun. I was in my late 40s, my hair beginning to gray at my temples, but I felt lighter than I had in the days when I was trying to figure out what to do about her letter and her secret. 10 years is a long time, and life, as it turned out, hadn't stood still for me, Amy, or those around us. After that night, I stayed with Travis for a couple months. I worked remotely, fixing computers for the same insurance company, but without the same zeal. My brother and I spent evenings on the porch, drinking beer and talking about everything but Amy. I didn't call her, and she didn't look for me. No calls, no texts, no chance encounters. 3 months later, I rented a small apartment in the same town where Travis lived and started a new life. The divorce was quietly finalized through a lawyer, with no arguments about who would get the house or the car. I left her everything but a couple boxes of my stuff. She didn't mind. We just went our separate ways, like two people who were too tired to pretend. Amy, I later learned, had sold the coffee shop a year after we broke up. One of my old coworkers, with whom I sometimes crossed paths in Portland, told me that she had left town. Rumor had it she was back in Idaho, the same town she had once fled from. I hadn't checked to see if it was true, but I liked to think she'd finally confronted her past, Leah, her family, the guilt that had chased her away all those years. Jake, as it turned out, had also disappeared from her life shortly after our last meeting at the coffee shop. A coworker had mentioned seeing him with another woman at some bar a couple years later, and I wasn't surprised. He was temporary for Amy, like a band-aid on a wound that never healed. I didn't look for a new relationship for a long time myself. After Amy, I didn't trust people the way I used to and preferred solitude. But about 5 years after the divorce, I met Kate, a teacher from a local school who was repairing her laptop at the shop where I worked part-time. She was quiet, with a dry sense of humor and a love of hiking, which I had begun to appreciate while living by the lake. We took our time just walking around, drinking coffee, sometimes traveling to the mountains. 2 years later, she moved in with me in this house, which I had bought with the money I had saved. We had no children, but we had a dog, a shaggy golden retriever named Max, who was now lying at my feet, sniffling in his sleep. One day, a couple years ago, I received a letter. It was a plain envelope, no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Amy wrote briefly. She was living in Idaho, working in a library, trying to get in touch with her mother. She didn't apologize, didn't ask to meet, just told me that she'd found Leah not alive, but in her grave. Turns out her sister didn't drown, but ran away like Amy, but fell into bad company and died of an overdose a year after she went missing. Amy found out by accident, through an old acquaintance, and buried her as best she could. She wrote that it gave her a peace she wasn't expecting, and that she was glad if I was doing well. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because I didn't know what to say, but I kept the letter in my desk drawer, next to the ticket to that concert we went to back in college. I was sitting on the porch now, listening to Kate cook breakfast. Inside, the smell of bacon was already wafting to me. Travis would occasionally stop by for a visit, bringing beer and news about his daughter, who was in college. I didn't work in IT anymore. I quit a couple years ago and took up boat repair for local fishermen. It was easier, quieter, and gave me time to think. Amy is probably still in Idaho, sorting through books and maybe remembering me occasionally. Jake is out there somewhere in his life, and I held no grudge against him. He was just a man caught up in our chaos. 10 years ago, I thought her letter and her secret would destroy me, but they just changed the path. I found my peace here by the lake, with Max at my feet and Kate behind me. Amy hopefully found hers in the town where she buried Leah. We both survived, though in different ways, and it was a logical end to our story. Not loud, not tragic, but quiet as the morning mist over the water. I finished my coffee, stroked Max, and went inside, closing the door behind me.